I'm really excited to be talking with Melissa Wu today. Melissa is Taiwanese American. She's also the CEO of Education Pioneers, called also Ed Pioneers. And before Ed Pioneers, she worked as a partner at TNTP. She was a consultant for the Boston Consulting Group. And she spent a lot of her career on issues of teacher retention, school and system improvement, as well as performance management. She has an MBA from Harvard Business School, and she has a bachelor's from Princeton. She's also a university trustee there. Finally, she's a mom to two kids who are right now 6 and 8. I'm really excited to talk with you, Melissa. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Melissa, we're going to learn all about you. And the question that I always like to start with is the journey of your life, starting from upbringing to how did you get to this big job that you have now?
So that's a big question, and one that can be answered so many different ways. But I grew up in Massachusetts, where I continue to live now. And I grew up in a community that had really amazing public schools and was also predominantly white. My mother is white, my father is Taiwanese. And I think I start with that because it was really a big part of my experience as a kid, being part of one of the only families of color, being one of the only, multiracial families in the community. And I didn't experience overt racial oppression through that, but I did often feel marginalized. I often felt othered. It was all very clear to me that I was different, how I was different. And that experience of sort of being on the outside, on the periphery, I saw the ways in which I think structural and systemic racism were playing out in communities, in culture. And I think I could access that because I had a lot of access to any space I really wanted, but still had kind of the position to be an outsider within that. And so I had kind of an interest in issues of social justice, issues of education. I come from a big extended family. My dad's one of 7 kids. My mom's one of 3. On my mom's side of the family, there wasn't a super strong college going culture. My dad's side of the family, there was a really strong college going culture. And so across 21 first cousins, across this big family, there was a real diversity of experiences. And even within just my dad's part of the family, there was still real differences between, my cousins whose parents worked in a laundromat in Jackson Heights, Queens, and my cousins whose parents were chemical engineers, 30 miles away in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And just seeing the ways in which all of that played out in their life experiences and their opportunities meant that when I went to college, I carried with me a real sense of understanding that I had of my own privilege, actually, that I had gone to this really strong public high school that prepared me well for a top college, and where it wasn't unusual for most of my classmates to be going on to 4-year colleges and many of us to be going to elite universities. Because I went to Princeton undergrad, and there were a few important experiences there. I actually participated in a fellowship program as a sophomore. It was my first time trying to get a real internship. I had jobs growing up, but they were, at the summer camp that I had gone to as a kid. That was what I usually did during the summer. And sophomore year, I was like, okay, I guess I can't be a summer camp counselor anymore. I need to actually go and get an internship. But I didn't really know how to do that. And my RA from freshman year was helping lead a program called Princeton Project 55 that was before the days of the internet and job boards, before the days of even idealist.org. There was not really clear pathways for students at places like Princeton to enter the nonprofit sector. And this program, Princeton Project 55, was doing just that, matching current undergrads with summer internships and recent graduates with year-long fellowships in the nonprofit sector in a select set of cities. So I did, through that program, a summer internship in Boston with Oxfam America, and just had my kind of world blown open because I didn't really know that you could get paid to fight global hunger, poverty, and inequity. And I sort of felt like I had really won something big in realizing that, because I had grown up in a family where service was a big part of how my mom raised us. It wasn't a big showy thing. I didn't have a lot of community service hours. It wasn't always really formal, but we were always, we went to church. We were always going to the local old age home and just chatting with residents or doing projects. My mom ran a 4-H club. I started a 4-H club as a as a high school student. So these just kind of this being in community and an orientation towards like, hey, if there's stuff that's wrong in the world, you should try to fix it, was something that I was like really raised with from a young age. And so it was so exciting to realize like I could do that work, which felt really important, more and really fulfilling. And I just didn't really realize you could do it outside of like volunteering. So that was one kind of big pivot point. And I ended up pursuing that after graduating as well, and got a year-long fellowship through that same program. And the year-long fellowship was, I think, really important because it gave me an opportunity to see through my peers as part of a cohort in a way that was more defined than in my summer experience. And I got to see New York City, where I did my fellowship placement at a startup called the Teak Fellowship. We got to see all sorts of issues, housing, legal, criminal justice, the city, like all aspects of the city. I was working in education at a college access program at that point, but it was an exciting moment to like look at all the issues that I was interested in. I was majoring in sociology, so I was really interested in all of these issues and what were the root causes of the injustices that we saw and what we now call the opportunity gap. It wasn't the language at the time, but I was really interested in where those things came from, and they came from places like housing. They came from economic inequality, but it was such a great laboratory to get to see that and to also play out some of my own thinking of what were some of the actionable levers. So I went from that experience. I stayed with the Teak Fellowship, which was a brand new organization. I was the first full-time employee at like an assistant to the founding executive director. I stayed there for 6 years, kind of growing with the organization, taking on different roles year over year. Ultimately serving as the deputy director and managing all of our staff and programs. I'd supported fundraising at various points throughout my trajectory there. But after 6 years, found myself really proud of the organization we had built and the lives of the students that we were touching and the families. But also recognizing that the work that we were doing as an academic enrichment program, we were helping talented kids from low-income families get into and succeed at top high schools so they'd be prepared for success when they went on to top colleges. I found myself, working at a program that was an intervention, really still concerned about what were the systemic issues and why, if we were touching 150 kids in New York City, what about the million students that weren't in our program, and what were the options for them, and how are we getting underneath the problems there? But this is where I maybe was thinking about going and getting a master's in social work or a public policy degree, because that's where my interests were. And I got a lot of advice from a lot of different people that I should really go and think about getting an MBA. I took this advice and went to Harvard for business school to kind of sharpen a set of managerial and leadership skill sets that kind of lots of people were telling me were in demand everywhere, really important everywhere, but also weren't necessarily being cultivated in the nonprofit sector, either as intentionally or with the level of kind of resource that places like an MBA program would bring to it. So did that, spent a couple of years after that in for-profit consulting with a firm called the Boston Consulting Group, trying to deepen those skills, exploring if there was a different kind of lever for impact from the private sector before ultimately coming back to education through those roles at TNTP and then ultimately education.
Thank you, Melissa. And I want to bring us back because your explanation of growing up as a Taiwanese American in a predominantly white neighborhood and seeing the discrepancies within your own family of the opportunity gap. And I'm curious, thinking back about myths, because we were told things about what it would take to succeed, what it would take to rise in your career, even if you had planned to do nonprofit. And I'm curious if you can remember a few of these myths that you were told by family or teachers, and what you found were actually true and what you found were actually not.
My experience was more just not actually knowing what else was out there, sort of actually only understanding and knowing about the career paths that I had literally seen in my family and that my family had access to. So my father was an electrical engineer, but he just like stayed in the engineering track. My mom had been a teacher at some point. She started a small company with my dad doing, kind of like small scale entrepreneurship. But she worked part-time growing up. So I didn't have a broad exposure to careers through my parents. And even if I think about through my extended family, folks were, a lot of engineers, some doctors, like there was, my uncles on my mom's side worked in more sort of like retail settings, service settings. And I didn't know about this whole class of careers in the nonprofit sector, in kind of in general management either. The myth that I think that I probably internalized was one of meritocracy and just being like really achievement oriented as being kind of like the path to success. If you just keep working really hard, if you keep really grinding, and if you work hard enough, like you'll get to that next thing. The myth of meritocracy like doesn't take into account what's your context and where do you start in the race, for the finish line, and what kind of opportunities do you have to develop. We have to like unpack, what's privileged and what isn't, in our own lives and in the systems that we're operating in. But there's also, I think that a fulfillment that's implied in striving and being the best that is like not fully possible, and not always like so being the best is like often not possible, and being the best or continuous achievement may or may not be fulfilling, right? And I think that that's one of the things that I've grappled with, or a lesson learned over time, particularly around like how valuable it is to learn through failure, how important it is to fail, and also how valuable it is to take risks that allow you to learn. And that's, I think that achievement orientation kind of builds a risk aversion. It's, put differently, like a fixed mindset orientation growing up as opposed to a growth mindset orientation growing up, and having some of that kind of play out over years and making some lessons harder over time.
There's so much there. I'm thinking to myself this idea that there are specific careers, and the careers are the ones we know of. And actually, there's so many more outside of what is in front of us. The second is that if you work hard, you'll achieve. It's all about working hard, doing your best. The third is that achievement is fulfillment. And maybe not always that's true. The fourth is don't risk, don't fail. Do the very best you can, but really don't take a ton of risks. So entrepreneurship and things like that just are less interesting and harder to choose because you're just trying to go on this meritocracy achievement path. And so these are really great because I learned these too as a kid growing up and trying to be the best kid I could be. And I'm curious for you, Melissa, through the different paths you've taken, is there a particular example that comes to mind for you where you learned one of these lessons or a couple of them?
Yeah, I think the failure lesson is the one that I've like worked on the most over time, and feels maybe where there's like feels like the one to maybe start with. I think I had an awareness leaving college that there were, or even in college, that I felt myself holding back on effort in places that were hard and actually capping my own learning and exploration and opportunities because I was afraid of failing. And I could recognize that happening while it was happening. But I wasn't yet able to disrupt the behavior. So I was actually like, Princeton is the kind of place where there's a lot of social pressure to conform, and there's a lot of people going in paths that were completely unknown to me. People going into investment banking, people going into consulting, people going into these like business fields. I didn't know anything about them. And there was a bit of pressure to be like, gosh, do all these people who majored in econ or like in engineering and are going into these fields, they know something that I don't know? Should I be trying for this? And so there was, as much as I was drawn to the social sector for like very genuine, like this is where my heart, and it's where I spent my career, and it's like, I wouldn't trade it for the world, but there was also a sense of like, I think I can get a job here. Like, I think I can find a place to contribute. And it felt a bit like a safe landing in some ways. And so there, I was able to kind of recognize this in myself, but not as able to confront it. And then, I had some failures early on in my first job. I think I had a lot of qualifications as a newly minted, college student, but I also had no experience, like really working in the real world, right? I had a couple of internships. I had, had responsibility, but it's very different than having kind of a 9-to-5 job. And I was responsible for editing our newsletter. And at one point, I like sent to print a newsletter that had typos in it. And my boss was she's a wonderful woman. I worked with her for a long time. She was so disappointed, and she was so angry at me because it was a real expense. We were a startup organization. It was not like, this was a mistake with consequences. And I had also really betrayed and damaged her trust. And I think it was one of the first times I had made like a real mistake with real consequences, and the consequences in the scheme of things were like not that huge, right? It was money, it was time, but I like really damaged like her trust and faith in me, and that was hard. But I had to. It was the two of us at that point. It was me and this founder, sitting in the basement of a school, trying to start this organization, and our primary means of generating income was sending this newsletter to people who might support our work, and they would send donations back, right? So this was an important thing to us. It was also how we were spreading the word about the organization. So there was no choice but to kind of pick up the next day and go back and like do that editing, like read the article, read all of our articles really carefully, fix all those mistakes and get it back out to the printer. So I think that was like an important experience of like, that felt awful, and I got through it. And I recognized that I was going to have to work twice as hard to kind of like, to do that work well. Later, I think that like experiences like that gave me more confidence, and being around young people and watching kind of the importance of their own learning experiences and seeing their bravery, like the Teak Fellows. We were pushing them to try new things, to try new experiences. We were pushing them to be on their outer limits. And I recognized, like, am I really doing this, right? Myself. And that's part of what pushed me to, to leave Teak, to kind of expand my boundaries and do something like go to business school, right? That was a little bit of a leap of faith, and trying something that I didn't know that I would be good at, trying something that would feel more competitive. I ran for section president as that was me putting myself out there, and I did not win. And I was not surprised that I didn't win, but it was this thing that I was like, I should try this. I've never like run for office, even though I sort of feel like I have something to contribute and I can be good at this job, right? So this responsibility, this role. So there were a bunch of experiences like those. Even going to consulting was the career counselors were saying, this is a hard path. It's super competitive. Like, you don't really have a background that's going to make sense. So you're going to have to work twice as hard. I think I had to prove to myself that I could put in the work on something that I wasn't expected to be successful at. And that if I did that, that I could, I was successful in that endeavor, right? So there was this set of experiences, most of which aren't clear, some of which are clear-cut mistakes or failures, but many of which are like much more of a muddle, right? Like, was I successful at business school? I mean, I graduated, I learned a bunch, I met people, I have friends, right? Like, yes, I was successful, but that experience was also very difficult on a bunch of like personal levels while I was there. And I think that whole stretch of time was a series of me like pushing myself out on a ledge and forcing myself to take a leap and and, some like whether it was a clear success or a clear failure or something in the middle, kind of realizing that like I could handle that, or I could survive it, I could learn from it, and I could like get better for the next time around.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense that there are these paths in the road and to make turns where you don't know where the road is headed. Those are risky. And yet as I listen to your story, there's a piece of, I want to try to do it and see if I can do it. And wow, I can do it. And then what's the next thing where it's going to be hard as well? I might risk and fail. I'll risk and I might fail, but I'm going to try to do it anyway. And I want to tie that idea to this concept of striving. You'd mentioned before that when you strive, you achieve, that we expect fulfillment. So I'm curious if that theme applies here, that in your hard work, whether it was HBS or onto consulting and working there for multiple years, I'm curious, did you feel fulfilled?
Yeah, I don't know that I felt fulfilled in those years. I mean, that's because there's so much more to life than just, I think I felt a lot of fulfillment my first kind of 6 or 7 years out of college. I was doing work I really cared about. I had community that I felt really connected to. I lived in New York City for that whole time. And, 6, 7 years in New York City as somebody who wasn't from there, like I stayed long enough to like make it my own. And I spent most of that time in Alphabet City in a very particular neighborhood, and had like friends from lots of different parts of life. So I felt really, I do think I felt fulfilled in that period of time. And I didn't have a family yet, but it was okay. Like I was in my 20s and I didn't feel like I needed that, but I had community and I felt grounded. I think that as I was going through this next phase, which was necessary to kind of like realize the ambitions I had for myself professionally, I think I sort of started to like hit a ceiling, and work wasn't as challenging. I was offered a path to stay at the Teak Fellowship and take the leadership, our founder was getting married and moving to California. So there was an opportunity for me to stay on and lead the organization. But ultimately I kind of recognized, gosh, I'm a big fish in a small pond here. This is the only job I've ever had. I want to expand my horizons. For me to feel fulfilled, I will need to kind of test myself a little bit and try something different, try to challenge myself a bit more. So I do think that whole pursuit was important to kind of feeling satisfied and fulfilled. But I certainly don't think it was enough. And that kind of phase of the journey that I was talking about, where I was testing myself a lot, I don't think was an era, excuse me, of feeling particularly fulfilled. And that was, I think, a combination of, it was a hard period. I didn't feel as grounded. I mean, as a graduate student, you're you're changing communities, you're building new communities, you're moving between communities. HBS I did not have a great experience at HBS on a personal level. It was, I describe it as being a highly conformist, risk averse, and sexist place, which was a really hard place to be. As a older student, I wasn't super old, but I was 7 years out of college and kind of at the older quartile probably of my class. As a woman, as a person from a non-traditional background, as somebody who saw the world pretty differently from many of my peers, it was a difficult place to be, speaking out a different truth than other people kind of, expected. And so that was those were hard experiences. And my time in consulting was like interesting, and pushed me to grow, but wasn't like, I didn't have, at that point, I was like wanting to find a partner and like thinking about kind of other parts of my life. And it was, in some ways, work was actually crowding a lot of that out. That period of like really testing myself and pushing myself to take risks was less about trying to seek fulfillment, I think, and seek achievement, as much as it was almost exposure therapy to not achieving and recognizing that's not the end of the world. And that does not necessarily an indictment on me as a person. And that was like, I think that was really the work, was the flip side, the negative side of that, which is like, it's okay to not be successful. And that doesn't actually, like, that doesn't define me, right? Like it was more about, I think, the times that it didn't work out as anything else.
I really appreciate the idea that we can try things that we might not be great at, and that might not lead to anything in terms of the next step, wanting to, for example, be a full-on partner as a consultant. And it's okay. We can try things, and that's the point. We tried it, and actually now we're clear. We don't want to do that. And so in a journey of a career, I was reminded of this book that I just heard about called The Second Mountain. And as we look at these careers and think about next steps and pivot points, where can we contribute? Where can we learn? Where can we grow? And then also, where can we build a community? Because that's something I've heard in your story, especially those first years out of college, when you felt like you were contributing to something bigger, you were part of a team and also part of a neighborhood of people that you felt close to, and you were learning and growing, and it felt so in sync until 6 years later, you're like, I want to continue to grow in a different spot. So there's change. And so it brings me to this question of becoming CEO. And I'm curious, did you have in your sights, I'm going to be CEO of an ed reform organization one day? As you planned this career, I'm curious if that was something that you had always wanted.
No. So the one word answer is no. Part of why I left TNTP, which was like really how I got to this seat, was I was at this really, TNTP at the time was like 300 or 400 people. It was becoming a professional services organization. My heart is not, that was one of the things I learned at BCG. I'm like not cut for like professional service organizations. I'm more of an operator than a consultant. And I had these roles at TNTP that were, where I got to be like a little GM, like a little mini, like general manager or leader of a specific line of business. And I loved that. But Scott Morgan came and talked to me, and I was like, wow, this is kind of my dream job. There's like a bunch of thorny problems here that don't have clear solutions. I like that kind of thing. It's an executive level role. I'm interested in trying that out. But I actually I often saw myself as like being better suited to playing number 2 role. But 10 months into my tenure at Education Pioneers, I think Scott like recognized that he wasn't the right leader for the right phase, decided to step away. And Ed Pioneers was actually headed towards a financial crisis that was partially, but not fully diagnosed. I got pulled into this CEO and enterprise leadership position. We didn't really have the time to do a national search. It was clear that we needed to make some changes, and we all kind of like, we looked around, and it sort of became clear that I was probably the right person to kind of step into Scott's seat. So I would say that it was definitely not my plan. I hadn't ruled it out, but it was definitely not in my near-term plan. There's a great quote, which I'm not going to be able to identify who said it in this moment, but I heard it at a DRK conference, and it really stuck with me, which is 50% of crisis leadership is the decision to lead, the decision to like take a step forward. I had a moment, I had a choice. And I think that I didn't necessarily feel like I had a choice. I felt like I had a lot of obligation to the team and the people and the organization and the work. I really believed in the mission and the work. And so I think I felt, duty to step into the role as well. Like there was a need for something, and I could contribute. I don't know, if I will seek out another enterprise leadership role, because they're hard. They're lonely, they're hard. And I think you've got to really, be up for it and have the energy and commitment for it. And so I could find myself in a very different kind of role after this one.
There is an interesting point about what you had mentioned about not necessarily wanting the role, and even after this role, not necessarily pursuing the top role again. And it's a theme that we hear in research, and other women like yourself who are really amazing at their careers, they don't tend to want the top seat. It's all about the work. Let's do the best we can, really mission driven. And while we have our male counterparts who are like, yep, I'm at the top seat, I can have the most impact there, it is about some power. So it's interesting to see the contrast in that there is some, gender bias in play. And so I'm curious, because you just mentioned the top role is incredibly difficult. So when could you share a time when you learned what would it really take to be successful in your role and also be a mom, also try to have a personal life?
I'm still learning. Even with all of that context training perspective, I was still, and I had read, through, again, HBS and these networks, it's like you read things in the HBR and whatever about the jump, right? And how lonely it is at the top. And I was still kind of unprepared for how far the distance was between being the chief program officer on an executive team to being the CEO and suddenly not having any peers, and suddenly not having a boss, only having a board. I think that like leading in crisis forced me to figure out how to compartmentalize for my own sanity. And I had really tiny kids. They were, probably roughly 2 and 4 when I became CEO. I think that through that, my ability to compartmentalize and recognize that I can't be both a CEO and a mom at the same time. I need to be focused on being a CEO in the moments that I'm doing that. And then for my own sanity, I need to be focused on being a mom when I'm doing that. And so I think I drew boundaries around certain times but also just my own kind of mental energy and space. I think I also just had to get comfortable with doing good enough. And that was really hard because I had gotten to the positions I had been in by being excellent. And that was the bar and I was striving for excellence. And now it's a question of like, not can I do things excellently, but can I do all the things or enough of the things or really it's about, can I do enough of the most important things well enough that we live to fight another day as an organization, that my kids can continue to grow and make progress, right? And it's I think consistently making those calls, but that involves being comfortable not doing everything, and that is hard and continues to be hard.
Thanks, Melissa. Such a thorough answer. All right, we're going to move to our last questions lightning round. Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. Chocolate or vanilla?
Chocolate.
Cooking or takeout?
Depends. Cooking.
Climb a mountain or jump from a plane?
Climb a mountain for sure.
Have you ever worn socks with sandals?
I don't think so.
How would you rate your karaoke skills on a scale of 1 to 10? 10 being Mariah Carey.
7.
Recent book you read?
I just finished Harry Potter #6, my daughter.
What's your favorite way to practice self-care?
I like spending time with friends, especially in beautiful places.
What's a good professional development you've done?
I am currently in a Pahara cohort, 39, which has been amazing so far, and I'm still in the process, but it feels super profound and important.
Pahara is amazing. What's your definition of a boss mama?
Oh man. Oh gosh. I mean, I think that the wonderful thing about that phrase is it could mean so many different things. But I think that moms who boss, right? Moms who are leaders in their organizations. I think that's a really incredibly important community and cohort of people. So it means that to me, but it could also just be a mom who's bossing at anything, right? I think that term could apply as well.
What advice would you give your younger self?
I push myself to take those risks earlier, to start experimenting and leaning into like being as focused on not taking learning for granted, being as focused on learning as achieving.
Where can we find you, like LinkedIn or any other social media?
LinkedIn is good. I have a fairly I'm working on my social media game. Let's put it that way. So I do have a Twitter handle. It might become more active sometime soon, but those LinkedIn and Twitter are probably good places.
And last question, do you have a final ask, recommendation, or any parting thoughts for the audience?
I think the last 2 years have been an exercise in like finding the space where we can be both gentle with ourselves and each other, give ourselves and each other grace without compromising like what it is we're trying to do. I think finding that boundary is so hard and so important so that we can continue to do all this really important work, but in ways that are truly sustainable, truly sustainable in that like we actually have, the people and the energy and the capacity to keep at it because the road's long and important.
The road is long. Melissa, thank you so much for your time and sharing your story. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's good to talk to you.